The summer heat in London was unbearable that Tuesday afternoon. Marcus Chen, a 28-year-old software engineer from California, wiped sweat from his forehead as he walked through the crowded streets near Buckingham Palace. He had been traveling through Europe for 3 weeks, documenting every moment on his social media accounts for his 50,000 followers. Marcus loved creating viral content. Back home, his friends knew him as the guy who would do almost anything for the perfect video. He had jumped into fountains in Rome, danced with street performers in Paris, and even convinced a mime in Barcelona to break character. Each stunt brought him thousands of likes and new followers. As he approached the famous palace gates, Marcus noticed the iconic royal guards standing at their posts. Dressed in their traditional red tunics and tall black bearskin hats, they stood perfectly still despite the sweltering heat. Tourists surrounded them, taking selfies and trying to make them laugh or react, but the guards remained motionless like statues. Marcus pulled out his phone and started recording. "Hey everyone, Marcus here in London. Check out these guards. They're literally not moving at all in this crazy heat." He zoomed in on one particular guard who looked to be in his early 30s, with sharp features and intense blue eyes that stared straight ahead. The guard, Sergeant James Wellington, had been serving in the Queen's Guard for 8 years. He took immense pride in his role and the discipline required to maintain the centuries-old tradition. James had grown up in a military family and understood the honor that came with protecting the royal family. To him, this wasn't just a job or a tourist attraction. It was a sacred duty. Marcus noticed how streams of sweat were running down the guard's face, yet the man didn't even blink. An idea started forming in his mind. He remembered seeing other tourists try to get reactions from the guards, but no one had ever succeeded. What if he could be the first? What if he could create content that would truly go viral? He looked around and spotted a nearby fountain where families were cooling off. Children were splashing in the water while their parents took photos. Marcus grinned as he filled his water bottle from the fountain. The water was refreshingly cool against his fingers. Walking back toward the guard, Marcus felt his heart racing with excitement. He positioned his phone to capture the perfect angle, making sure both he and the guard would be clearly visible in the frame. His finger hovered over the record button as he rehearsed what he would say to his followers. "This is going to be epic," Marcus whispered to himself, completely unaware of the serious consequences his next actions would bring. He had no idea that Sergeant Wellington wasn't just any ordinary guard, or that the man standing so perfectly still had a background that made him particularly unsuited to being the target of pranks. The crowd around them grew thicker as more tourists gathered to take photos. Street vendors called out their wares and the sound of multiple languages filled the air. In all this chaos, Marcus felt anonymous, just another tourist among thousands. He convinced himself that what he was about to do was harmless fun that would bring joy to his followers. As he pressed record and took a step closer to the motionless guard, Marcus had no way of knowing that this moment would change everything. He couldn't see the internal struggle that Sergeant Wellington faced every day, or understand the deep respect for tradition that kept the man standing perfectly still despite every distraction. Most importantly, Marcus couldn't predict how dramatically his life was about to change with one simple, thoughtless action. Marcus held his phone steady, making sure the camera captured everything perfectly. He had done this kind of content creation hundreds of times before, but something felt different about this moment. The guard looked so serious, so professional, that Marcus almost felt bad about what he was planning to do. Almost. "Okay, guys, watch this," Marcus whispered into his phone camera. "I'm about to help this poor guard cool down. He looks like he's dying in this heat." He laughed softly, thinking his followers would find his reasoning hilarious. Sergeant Wellington could see the tourist approaching from his peripheral vision, but his training kept him focused straight ahead. In his 8 years of service, James had endured countless attempts from visitors trying to break his concentration. People had made funny faces, told jokes, even tried to tickle him. He had learned to block out these distractions completely, but James had been having a particularly difficult week. Just 3 days earlier, he had received news that his younger brother Tom, also serving in the military, had been injured during a training exercise overseas. Tom was in the hospital, and James hadn't been able to visit him due to his guard duties. The stress was eating at him, though he never let it show on his face. Marcus stepped closer, now just 3 feet away from the guard. He could see the beads of sweat on the man's forehead and felt a moment of genuine sympathy. The temperature had reached 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and wearing that heavy uniform must have been torture. Marcus told himself he was actually doing a good deed. "Here goes nothing," Marcus said to his camera, then quickly splashed the cold water from his bottle directly onto Sergeant Wellington's face and chest. The reaction was immediate and completely unexpected. Instead of remaining motionless or giving a small smile like Marcus had hoped, the guard's entire body tensed. His jaw clenched, and for just a moment his carefully controlled expression cracked. James felt the cold water hit him like a shock, not just physically but emotionally. In that instant, all the stress, worry about his brother, and years of maintaining perfect discipline while tourists treated him like a living statue came rushing to the surface. The water dripped from his chin onto his pristine red tunic, staining the fabric. James had spent 2 hours that morning ensuring his uniform was perfect, and now it was ruined. The crowd around them fell silent. Other tourists stopped taking photos and stared at the scene unfolding before them. Marcus continued recording, expecting the guard to wipe his face or maybe even thank him for the relief from the heat. Instead, he saw something in the guard's eyes that made his stomach drop. Sergeant Wellington slowly turned his head to look directly at Marcus. His blue eyes, which had seemed calm and distant before, now burned with controlled fury. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady, but every word carried the weight of years of military training and barely contained anger. "Sir, you have just assaulted a member of Her Majesty's Guard while on active duty." Marcus felt his confidence crumble. This wasn't going according to plan at all. "Hey, I was just trying to help you cool off, man. It's so hot and you looked like you needed—" "Step back immediately," James commanded, his voice cutting through Marcus's explanation like a knife. The authority in his tone made several nearby tourists instinctively move away. Marcus realized he had made a terrible mistake. The guard wasn't smiling or laughing like he had imagined. Instead, the man looked genuinely angry, and Marcus suddenly remembered that these weren't just actors in costumes for tourist entertainment. These were real soldiers with real authority. "I didn't mean any harm," Marcus stammered, still holding his phone but no longer sure if he should keep recording. The video that was supposed to make him internet famous was quickly turning into his worst nightmare. The water continued to drip from Sergeant Wellington's uniform as he maintained eye contact with Marcus. Around them, the atmosphere had completely changed. What started as a typical tourist day had become something much more serious, and Marcus was beginning to understand that his simple prank had crossed a line he never should have approached. Within seconds of Sergeant Wellington's command, 2 police officers appeared as if from nowhere. Marcus had been so focused on the guard that he hadn't noticed the security presence around the palace area. The officers, both wearing the distinctive uniforms of the Metropolitan Police, approached with serious expressions. "What's the situation here, Sergeant?" the older officer asked Wellington, while keeping his eyes on Marcus. "This individual threw water at me while I was on duty," Wellington replied, water still visible on his uniform. He recorded the entire incident on his phone. Marcus felt panic rising in his chest. "Officers, this is just a misunderstanding. I was trying to be nice. The guy looked hot, so I thought I'd help him cool down. It was meant to be funny." He held up his phone as if the video would somehow prove his innocent intentions. The younger police officer, Constable Sarah Mitchell, had dealt with many tourist incidents over her 5 years on the job. She had seen everything from people trying to climb the palace gates to tourists attempting to feed the Queen's horses. But something about this situation felt different. "Sir, I need you to understand something," Constable Mitchell said to Marcus. "What you've done isn't a harmless prank. You've assaulted a member of the Queen's Guard during his official duties. This is a serious offense under British law." Marcus looked around desperately at the crowd of tourists who had gathered to watch the drama unfold. Many were recording the scene with their phones, and Marcus realized that instead of creating viral content, he had become the subject of it. His face would soon be all over social media, but not in the way he had planned. "Look, I'm really sorry," Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm just a tourist from America. I didn't know it was illegal. Can't we just forget this happened?" Sergeant Wellington wiped water from his face with the back of his gloved hand. The gesture was small, but it reminded everyone present that a real person stood behind the ceremonial uniform. "The damage is already done," he said quietly. My uniform is soaked and I'll need to be relieved from duty to change. This was true. The Queen's Guard maintained strict standards for their appearance, and Wellington's water-stained tunic was no longer suitable for his post. Another guard would have to be called in to replace him, disrupting the carefully maintained schedule and protocol. The older police officer, Inspector David Hughes, had been working the palace beat for 15 years. He had seen the respect and dedication these guards showed every day, rain or shine. "Son," he said to Marcus, "these men and women take their duties very seriously. They're not here for your entertainment." Marcus felt the weight of everyone's stares. British tourists looked at him with obvious disapproval, while other Americans in the crowd seemed embarrassed by his behavior. A family from Japan had stopped taking photos and were quietly discussing the incident among themselves. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, his earlier confidence completely gone. Inspector Hughes pulled out his notebook. "We'll need to take your details and a statement. Depending on what the sergeant decides to do, you could be facing charges for assault." "Assault?" Marcus's voice rose an octave. "I splashed water on him." "It's 85 degrees outside." "Temperature is irrelevant," Constable Mitchell explained patiently. "You made physical contact with a member of the armed forces without permission, while they were performing their duties. In British law, that constitutes assault, regardless of your intentions." Sergeant Wellington stood silently, watching Marcus realize the seriousness of his situation. James had dealt with difficult tourists before, but something about this young man's complete disregard for the dignity of his position struck him particularly hard. Combined with his worry about his injured brother and the stress of his demanding role, James felt his patience wearing thin. Marcus looked at his phone, which was still recording. The video that was supposed to get thousands of likes and shares had turned into evidence of his own crime. He stopped the recording and shoved the phone into his pocket, wishing he had never come up with this terrible idea. "Please," Marcus said, looking directly at Wellington. "I'm really sorry. I was stupid. Can you please not press charges?" The crowd waited in tense silence for the guard's response, unaware that his decision would soon become the subject of international news coverage. Sergeant Wellington looked at Marcus for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The crowd had grown larger, with people stopping their sightseeing to watch the confrontation. Street performers had paused their acts, and even the usually busy traffic seemed quieter as the tension built. "What's your name?" Wellington asked Marcus, his voice steady but cold. "Marcus Chen," he replied, hoping that giving his name would somehow make the guards see him as a real person, rather than just another disrespectful tourist. Wellington nodded slowly. "Mr. Chen, do you know what this uniform represents?" Marcus shook his head, suddenly feeling very young despite being 28 years old. "This uniform represents over 350 years of tradition. Men and women have died wearing uniforms like this one, protecting not just the royal family but the values and dignity of an entire nation." Wellington's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "When you threw water at me, you weren't just disrespecting me personally. You were disrespecting every soldier who has ever stood in this position." The crowd murmured in agreement. Marcus felt his face burning with shame as he began to understand the deeper meaning of what he had done. Inspector Hughes stepped forward. "Sergeant, what would you like us to do?" Wellington was quiet for nearly a full minute, considering his options. He could press full charges, which would likely result in Marcus being arrested, spending time in jail and facing a criminal record. Or he could let it go with a warning. But as he looked at the young man's expensive camera equipment and designer clothes, James felt that a simple warning wouldn't be enough. "I want to press charges," Wellington said finally, "but not for assault." Everyone looked confused, including the police officers. Wellington continued, "I want to charge him with disturbing the peace and disorderly conduct, and I want him to spend 24 hours doing community service with a veterans organization." Inspector Hughes raised his eyebrows. This was an unusual request, but not unreasonable. "Community service?" Marcus asked, not sure if this was better or worse than the alternative. "Yes," Wellington replied. "You'll spend a full day with veterans who understand what military service really means. You'll hear their stories, help them with daily tasks, and maybe learn some respect." Constable Mitchell made notes in her pad. "That's actually quite fair, Sergeant." Marcus felt a wave of relief. Community service sounded much better than jail time. "Thank you," he said quickly. I'll do whatever you want. I really am sorry. But Wellington wasn't finished. There's one more condition. The crowd leaned in, curious about what else the guard might demand. You'll delete that video from your phone and promise never to post anything about this incident on social media. Marcus's heart sank. The video, even though it showed his embarrassing mistake, might still get views. He had been hoping to salvage something from this disaster. But, my followers, Mr. Chen, Wellington interrupted, this is not negotiable. You wanted to use me for entertainment without my permission. Now you need to accept the consequences without profiting from your mistake. Inspector Hughes nodded approvingly. Sounds reasonable to me. What do you say, Mr. Chen? Marcus looked around at the crowd of disappointed faces staring at him. Many people were still recording with their phones, and he realized that even if he deleted his own video, the story would probably still end up online. At least this way he might avoid serious legal trouble. Okay, Marcus said quietly. I agree to your terms. Good, Wellington replied. He turned to the police officers. I'll need to file a formal complaint, but I'm satisfied with this resolution. As the police officers began the paperwork process, Marcus deleted the video from his phone under their supervision. Watching months of potential social media content disappear forever, he finally began to understand that some things were more important than internet fame. Wellington prepared to return to his post after changing his uniform, but he had one final thing to say. Mr. Chen, I hope this experience teaches you that real people aren't props for your entertainment. We all have lives, families, and feelings behind whatever job we do. Marcus nodded, feeling smaller than he ever had in his adult life. As the crowd began to disperse and the police finished their reports, he realized that this moment in London would stay with him much longer than any viral video ever could have. 2 days later, Marcus found himself standing outside the Royal British Legion building in South London, feeling more nervous than he had since his college graduation. He had spent the previous night researching what the organization did, learning that it supported veterans and their families across the United Kingdom. The building was smaller than he expected, with a simple sign and well-maintained gardens where several elderly men sat on benches, chatting quietly. Marcus took a deep breath and walked through the front door, where a cheerful woman in her 60s greeted him. You must be Marcus, she said with a warm smile. I'm Margaret Thompson, the volunteer coordinator. Sergeant Wellington called and explained your situation. Marcus felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. Yes, ma'am. I'm here to do my community service. Margaret's expression became more serious but remained kind. Well, you've come to the right place to learn about service. Follow me, and I'll introduce you to some people who can teach you what that word really means. She led him into a common room where about a dozen veterans of various ages were sitting around tables, some playing cards, others reading newspapers, and a few working on crafts. The room fell quiet when Marcus entered. Everyone, this is Marcus, Margaret announced. He's here to help us out for the day and learn a bit about what we do here. An older man with gray hair and kind eyes looked up from his newspaper. American? He asked, noticing Marcus's accent. Yes, sir. From California. The man stood and extended his hand. I'm George Patterson. Served in the Falklands War. His handshake was firm and confident. What brings a young American to volunteer with us? Marcus hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Margaret stepped in gently. Marcus had a small incident with one of our Queen's Guards and is here to better understand military service. George's eyebrows raised with interest. One of those tourists who thinks the Guards are just for show? I made a mistake, Marcus admitted quietly. A big one. Another veteran, a woman in her 40s with a prosthetic leg, spoke up. Well, mistakes are how we learn, aren't they? I'm Linda Hayes. Served 3 tours in Afghanistan. Lost my leg to an IED, but gained perspective on what's really important in life. Over the next several hours, Marcus found himself doing tasks he had never imagined. He helped serve lunch to elderly veterans, many of whom had limited mobility. He listened to George tell stories about his time in the South Atlantic, fighting in freezing conditions thousands of miles from home. During lunch, Marcus sat with Harold, a 92-year-old World War II veteran who had landed at Normandy on D-Day. Harold's hands shook slightly as he ate, and Marcus helped him cut his food without being asked. You know, son, Harold said in a voice that carried the weight of nearly a century of life, when I was your age, I thought war would be an adventure. I had no idea what sacrifice really meant until I watched my friends die on those beaches in France. Marcus listened intently, realizing he had never met anyone who had experienced real combat. Linda joined their conversation. These days, people think military service is easy because they see us in parades or standing guard at ceremonies. They don't understand the training, the discipline, or the mental strength it takes to do the job properly. The guard you splashed water on, George added, having heard the full story from Margaret. He probably spent years training to stand perfectly still regardless of weather, distractions, or personal problems. That kind of discipline doesn't come naturally. As the afternoon progressed, Marcus helped organize supplies for care packages that would be sent to current service members overseas. He folded clothes, packed toiletries, and wrote encouraging notes from the veterans to young soldiers they had never met. "Why do you do this?" Marcus asked Linda as they worked together. "You've already served your country. Why keep helping?" Linda smiled sadly. "Because service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. These young men and women overseas are carrying on the tradition that we started. The least we can do is let them know they're not forgotten." By evening, Marcus felt emotionally drained but also strangely fulfilled. He had expected community service to be boring, busy work, but instead he had spent the day with people who had genuinely shaped history through their sacrifices. As he prepared to leave, George pulled him aside. "Marcus, I hope today helped you understand something important. When you see someone in uniform, you're not just looking at a person doing a job. You're seeing someone who has chosen to put service above self, often at great personal cost." Marcus nodded, thinking about Sergeant Wellington standing in the heat, maintaining his post despite whatever personal struggles he might be facing. For the first time since the incident, Marcus truly understood the magnitude of his disrespect. "Thank you," he said to George, and meant it more than he had ever meant anything in his life. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood once again in front of Buckingham Palace, but this time he felt completely different. The sun was shining, and tourists buzzed around him taking photos and selfies, but Marcus barely noticed them. He was focused entirely on finding one particular guard. After his day at the Royal British Legion, Marcus had spent hours researching the Queen's Guard, learning about their training, their history, and their role in British society. He had also tried to find a way to contact Sergeant Wellington, but the military wouldn't provide personal information about serving members. Marcus had cut his European vacation short, canceling plans to visit Germany and the Netherlands. Instead, he had returned to London with a specific purpose. He carried with him a carefully written letter and a small gift that he had spent days selecting. He waited patiently for nearly 3 hours, watching as different guards rotated through their posts. Finally, he recognized the familiar face and sharp blue eyes of Sergeant Wellington, taking position at the main gate. Marcus approached slowly, his heart pounding with nervousness. Several tourists were already gathered around the guard, taking photos and trying unsuccessfully to get reactions. Marcus waited until the crowd thinned before stepping forward. "Sergeant Wellington," he said quietly, standing at a respectful distance. The guard's eyes flicked toward Marcus, and there was a moment of recognition. James remembered the young American who had caused such a scene weeks earlier. "I know you probably can't talk to me while you're on duty," Marcus continued, "but I wanted to give you this." He held up an envelope. "It's a letter explaining what I learned from my community service and an apology. A real one this time." Marcus placed the envelope on the ground near the guard's feet, far enough away that it wouldn't interfere with Wellington's duties, but close enough that he could retrieve it later. "I also wanted you to know that I donated the money I would have spent on the rest of my vacation to the Royal British Legion," Marcus said. "It wasn't much, but I figured it was better than spending it on more tourist stuff." Sergeant Wellington remained perfectly still, but Marcus thought he saw something change in the man's eyes. Perhaps it was surprise or maybe approval. Marcus couldn't be sure. "I met some incredible veterans during my community service," Marcus continued, speaking quietly so nearby tourists couldn't hear. "They helped me understand what service really means and why what I did was so disrespectful. I'm genuinely sorry." Marcus started to walk away but turned back for one final comment. "Oh, and I changed my social media completely. Instead of posting pranks and stupid stunts, I've been sharing stories about veterans and military history. I've lost some followers, but I've gained something more important." As Marcus walked away, he felt a sense of closure he hadn't expected. He didn't need the guard to respond or even acknowledge his apology. The act of making it was enough. That evening, Marcus was packing his bags in his hotel room when his phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown London number. "Hello?" Marcus answered cautiously. "Is this Marcus Chen?" The voice was formal but not unfriendly. "Yes, this is Marcus. This is Sergeant James Wellington. I received your letter." Marcus nearly dropped his phone. "Sergeant, I wasn't sure if you'd want to hear from me." "I read what you wrote about your time with the veterans," James said. "It sounds like you learned quite a lot." "I did. More than I ever expected." There was a pause before James continued. "I wanted you to know that I appreciate your apology. It took courage to come back and face what you had done." Marcus felt relief wash over him. "Thank you for giving me that chance to learn instead of just getting me arrested." "Everyone deserves an opportunity to grow from their mistakes," James replied. "I'm glad you made the most of yours." They talked for a few more minutes, and Marcus learned that James's brother was recovering well from his injuries. Before hanging up, James said something that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. "Mr. Chen, real honor isn't about being perfect. It's about how you handle yourself when you make mistakes. You've shown real honor in how you've dealt with this situation." After ending the call, Marcus sat in his hotel room reflecting on how much his life had changed in just a few weeks. He had come to London looking for viral content and internet fame, but instead had found something much more valuable: respect for others and understanding of true service. The next morning, as Marcus boarded his flight back to California, he knew he would return to London someday. But when he did, it would be as a different person entirely, one who understood that some things were more important than getting likes and shares on social media. The lesson he learned from one splash of water had changed his perspective on life forever.